All right, everyone. Welcome to our final session of Within Summit 2022. Thank you so much for being here today. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded live, and if you would like to watch the replay or if there's any great tidbits that you missed and you want to, jot down, you can go and watch the replay in your attendee dashboard after the session has ended. I also want to remind everybody that if you have any thoughts, questions, comments during the session, please drop those in the Q&A box or in the chat box so that we can get to your questions and comments at the end of the session. I would love to kick things off by introducing our amazing moderator and our speaker today. Moderating, we have Katie Piel. Katie has been working in treatment as a therapist specializing in eating disorders for 3 years. Her integrative approach is rooted in evidence-based psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral theories to help clients increase insight and awareness while supporting healing and change. Katie believes that as we move through life, disconnection from our innate knowledge creates painful internal dissonance, conflict, suffering, and disruption in our lives. Recovery emerges as clients discover and align with their values and gain the confidence to live authentically. A native New Yorker, Katie lives in Los Angeles and became a therapist after many years working in the entertainment industry. She loves dogs, beaches, and being an aunt. Katie, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's like a dating profile. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, Katie's amazing. And I'm also so excited and honored to welcome Virgie Tovar. Virgie is a journalist at Forbes. She's an author, an activist, and a leading expert on weight-based discrimination. She holds a master's degree in sexuality studies with a focus on the intersections of body size, race, and gender. She is a contributor for Forbes, where she covers the plus size market and how to end weight discrimination at work. She started the hashtag campaign, hashtag lose hate, not weight, which I love. And in 2018, gave a TEDx talk on the origins of the campaign. Virgie edited the anthology Hot and Heavy, Fierce Fat Girls on Life, Love, and Fashion, published by Seal Press. And she's the author of You Have the Right to Remain Fat, which has placed on the American Library Association's Amelia Bloomer list, The Self-Love Revolution, Radical Body Positivity for Girls of Color, and her new interactive book, The Body Positive Journal. Her podcast, Rebel Eaters Club, is now in season 3 and is Transmitter Media's first original production. In 2018, she was named one of the 50 most influential feminists by Bitch magazine. She has received 3 San Francisco Arts Commission individual artist commissions, as well as Yale's Poynter Fellowship in Journalism. Virgie has been featured by the New York Times, Tech Insider, BBC, MTV, NPR, and Yahoo Health. She lives in San Francisco. Welcome, Virgie. We're so excited and honored to have you today.
Thank you. Thank you for reading the long version.
Of course, we have to celebrate all your amazing accomplishments.
Thank you.
All right, Katie, I'm going to pass things on to you to get us rolling today.
Thank you. So Virgie, I'm so excited to have the opportunity to have this chat with you and to bring your wisdom into the Within Summit. So we're sort of broadly talking about eating disorders in the workplace and how to make the workplace sort of safe and accommodating, with a thought towards people with disordered eating, body image issues, and eating disorders. I'd love to just sort of give you the floor and hear a little bit about your insight. We can go from there.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, this topic is really near and dear to my heart. I remember kind of the first time I ever interface. I mean, obviously, right? Like, I think, there's sort of many chapters in this story, like to begin with. And I also kind of want to recognize that I'll be talking about disordered eating, but I'll also be talking sometimes almost interchangeably about weight discrimination, because they do really go hand in hand. And so a lot of my experience with the workplace, I mean, first of all, my experience with sort of the formal workplace, the workplace as we think of it in the cultural imagination, which is like the office, my experience is fairly limited in many ways because of experiencing weight discrimination in hiring, right? Like a really important fact that I always like to tell people, I don't like telling people, but that's important to share, is that plus size women in particular make anywhere between $9,000 and $19,000 less per year than their straight size counterparts. And, you know, when researchers have looked into this phenomenon and tried to understand why, there's a lot of different potential hypotheses, but one really strong one is that hiring discrimination, I mean, it's interesting, right? Hiring discrimination doesn't just happen like in that moment when you're being interviewed. It's all the moments before then. It's, you know, it's about how much weight discrimination did you experience growing up? How much did that impact your confidence? How much did that impact your ability to sort of see yourself in that kind of workspace environment that's in the cultural imagination? And so I had a really hard time. I could not get hired I mean, you know, in my dream life, right? I would graduate from college, kind of like, you know, what I saw in movies and television, and I would work downtown in San Francisco, like a lot. And I mean, I graduated as an undergraduate in 2005. So I thought, okay, I'm just gonna, you know, start applying for work in the financial district in San Francisco, where I was living at the time. I still live there now. And so, you know, and I just found it really, really difficult to get, you know, I would get maybe one or two rounds of interviews, usually with a woman. The final interview was almost always with a person who I read as like a straight cisgender white man. And I would never get the job once that kind of became like, you know, he always kind of seemed to have the arbitrating decision. And I would never quite make it with that point in the hiring process. And so I sort of turned away from frankly, like I've talked to many, many, many plus size women who had very similar experiences and ended up becoming entrepreneurs and solopreneurs because of weight discrimination, right? And like, I think there's something, I mean, right, like I mean, I love being a solopreneur. There's a lot to be said about it. But I think it's important to understand that this was, you know, an attempt at having meaningful, gainful employment. And when you're a solopreneur, you're taking on all of the risk of an employer. So, you know, there's already like I would say like it takes quite a while to get to the point where you're making enough money on your own to be able to cover your costs. And you have to take on all of the liability that goes with all of that kind of early startup process. And I was one of those people too. And so I supplemented my income with, I turned to the nonprofit world and the teaching world, right? And this kind of goes back to the income gap, right? What they found with plus size women is that because of hiring discrimination and bias, plus size women are in more care-oriented, physically oriented jobs that pay less. And straight size women are in client-facing positions that pay more and that are desk jobs. So, I mean, I kind of want to call out even that fact because, right, there is this cultural bigotry that positions like plus size women as kind of lazy and immobile and all these things. And I'm like, well, the labor statistics would seem to indicate that actually plus size women are likelier to be on our feet all day doing laborious work. And it is actually like, you know, straight size women who are sitting at desks. And that's not sort of to point fingers or anything, but I sort of think it's like important to understand that oftentimes bigotry leads to a really misguided understanding of what's really actually happening. And so I kind of wanted to start there. That's like a big part of the chapter, a big chapter. And like that, the conversation about the workplace really starts with like, who gets to be in certain workplaces, who is really like not even at the point where they're experiencing being triggered at work through eating disorder triggering conversations because of weight discrimination. How many people are like, experiencing things that are intersecting. Like I certainly see like people with eating disorders and people who are working towards like fat liberation or fat rights, right? Are certainly like an affinity. And if those people aren't even in the same room because of weight discrimination, like that's something to note. But anyway, to kind of continue the next chapter really is once I started doing my own business, working with people who experience weight discrimination, want some kind of help with navigating a culture that is saturated with fat phobia and weight discrimination. One of the first questions I would ask clients would be, where are you getting triggered the most? And I certainly had my theories about what they were going to say. And I was frankly really surprised at that time to hear again and again the workplace. I was certainly expecting, dating apps, or when I go home and see family members during holidays, or I was really expecting kind of like, I think we think of these as the usual suspects for being triggered, and they certainly do trigger. But the workplace was fascinating because what I found was that, or what they were reporting was that not only were they getting triggered, but they felt completely incapable of setting boundaries. They felt completely afraid of, social isolation should they be someone who speaks up, and they were afraid of getting fired or being considered hostile in the workplace. So, I mean, I think it's really, it's interesting, right? Because again, we might be getting triggered on dating apps at home with our families or whatever, but we do have some latitude, obviously, depending on the situation. We do have a fair amount of latitude. Like we can set a boundary. Like, I'm not going to talk to this person after a certain point. That is really not super possible in a workplace if that person is your boss or your colleague or something like that. So I kind of want to say, like, it was really powerful to have the workplace become something that was on my radar as something that really needed to be focused on for management, and that it was a very delicate type of management because of the fact that people rely on income from their jobs to survive. And so it creates kind of a difficult situation. But I think that's kind of like chapter 2 in some ways. And then chapter 3 has really been unfolding, right? And I kind of want to talk about some of the things that were covered in an article I did on this for Forbes. I worked with an incredible organization called Project Piel, and they do amazing work in creating access for people with disordered eating or eating disorders. And we worked together to create an article called 6 Ways to Create an Eating Disorder Informed Workplace. And I kind of just want to walk through them because they're so powerful, and some of them are mind-boggling, and yet I think actionable and fairly straightforward. So the first thing is kind of recognizing that eating disorders can affect anyone, no matter their size, race, gender, or sexual orientation. Just kind of like awareness, right? There is this still, I mean, I know this audience is aware of this, but I think when you look at the diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder, it's racialized, it's gendered, and it's also, it's size-based. Like I'm someone who had an eating disorder and was literally telling my doctor basically that I had an eating disorder even as a child, and he was celebrating it. And he was telling me that I was doing a great job, that whatever I was doing, I should keep doing it. And that I should basically, so, I think when you're in a bigger body, you are being, given as the cure for your body, you are being given, the advice to have an eating disorder. So I think there's that. But in addition, right, like even once I realized that I had an eating disorder, I mean, it still feels really hard to even claim that still. The fact that if you're in a bigger body and you try and talk to people about it, it might be shocking. They might be kind of like, you might be mocked. I mean, certainly I watched like when Tess Holliday went public about her eating disorder, just kind of getting, mocked by the media. And I think that those kinds of moments really show us that it's not safe for us to even identify ourselves, and we might even, I mean, again, like for me, I was hiding that from myself
Sure.
for a lot of years when I was deep in what I call like diet culture. A lot of times I think, I think this is true of people of all sizes, but I think especially if you're in a larger body, it's been very difficult for me to separate where dieting and disordered eating, like where one ends and the other begins. It still feels really convoluted, even in the cultural conversation. So anyway, kind of like, and obviously, right, BIPOC, right? If you're like a person of color, if you are trans, if you are, like queer even, like these are all things that are going to be barriers to you getting a diagnosis and even identifying this as an issue within yourself, right? Because of the ways that diet culture, for example, maps onto racism, like, people of color can diet and be athletic and maybe even have orthorexia or an eating disorder, and it's considered, right, this is a way of coping with racism. Like I can't control, whether I experience racism, but I can control whether I experience fat phobia. I can deal with the fact that I'm the only person of color on my staff by being on board with like a weight loss challenge or on board with like a food shaming conversation. And similarly, I think like there's these interesting ways in which diet culture, disordered eating, weight discrimination, et cetera, all intersect with things like being trans or like, trying to sort of be read as a specific gender, like fat phobia and kind of going along with diet culture can sometimes be a way in which gender confirmation or like internal gender affirmation is happening. Right. And so like there's all these kinds of interesting intersections with these communities. So not only is it a diagnostic barrier, but it's also like a personal identity barrier. But anyway, so recognizing that eating disorders are not what we all have come to associate with when we think of an eating disorder, which is like a white, young, able-bodied, thin, cisgender woman or girl. And then the second thing that we talked about in the article was, don't hold weight loss challenges, refrain from making value-based comments about food or bodies at work, like just getting rid of like the kind of chatter. And you and I, before this call, Katie, talked about the sacred silence, which I'm sure we'll return to in a minute, but like, this is the moment in the workplace where like you have the opportunity to actually opt out of just kind of the chatter. Like you actually can give yourself permission to take a long vacation, or even a short vacation just to see what it's like not to talk about food and bodies all of the time, all day long. And you begin to realize how ubiquitous the conversation is. Like all of these things are triggers, right? And these are things that coworkers can't opt out of.
Right.
Like you can't like, and I think, right, what's difficult is like that moment, that passing comment that takes a few seconds. Like it's a very, the person who is triggered, like the person who has an eating disorder, or a person in a larger body. Again, I want to kind of like say like these things are working in tandem. What are you going to do in the workplace? Sort of say, hey, wait a minute, and sort of start like a long conversation that might be awkward. You might not know all the answers to the questions that a person might have if they're pushing back on your boundary, like, and then of course, like risking being considered hostile or overreactive, right? Like all of these things are going through the mind of someone who has an eating disorder in the workplace, right? How do you address it? It's very difficult, especially if there's hierarchy, if there's a power differential. So, don't have those things. And I think specifically don't have weight restricted activities. I always think of a story of like a former partner of mine who, his workplace was having kind of a team building thing, and they didn't really check in with people. They just decided to sort of announce they were going to do indoor skydiving, which is weight restricted. And he actually, couldn't do it. So it made him feel alienated and made him feel like he had ruined everybody's excitement. Like they had announced it and he had to kind of raise his hand to let them know that he wasn't going to be able to participate. And he hoped that this didn't make him seem like he's not a team player. Like these kinds of moments, again, like where this is a disordered eating conversation, but it's also a conversation about weight discrimination.
Sure.
The third thing that we talked about was like, be careful with food-centered staff events, like just eating in groups when you don't quite know, or you don't quite know everybody's stance on things. You don't know if you are going to be respected or seen, or your boundaries or you might know that they are absolutely not going to be respected. You're going to be activated. So, Project Heal actually argued for not doing group eating events or not making them mandatory, like not having food at the meeting, because it can become extremely distracting, distressing, and triggering, frankly. So that was really, really powerful. The fourth thing, only a few more. So I love that they advocated that employers keep eating disorders in mind as they set insurance coverage and plans, and to be patient with eating disorder recovery. So I love this call out to, that I think there is this idea or this sense that when you have an eating disorder, you are supposed to sort of actively be the one who's setting the boundaries, who's educating, doing all the labor around setting the guardrails. But I love that they call out, like, actually, there's somebody sort of in a different part of the pipeline who can create a supportive environment. Like if your employer is aware of eating disorders, the fact that there's a very good chance that there's several people in the workplace who have an eating disorder, that you will not be able to visually identify them. If that competency is all there, I think that really helps sort of set the tone. But specifically when we're talking about like the brass tacks of insurance, like what's going to get covered? Is eating disorder treatment going to get covered? Is it going to be considered with the seriousness in terms of like mental health that it really deserves? And so I think that, we're more and more, I think there's a conversation in the workplace about serious mental illness, right? But like, I think eating disorders really do still seem like this kind of ancillary specialty boutique conversation when it really shouldn't be. Katie, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, well, to your point here, which is so important, right? When we are talking about benefits, right, that you are lucky enough to have, if you're lucky enough to have a job that provides healthcare, what do the policies say from the insurance, right? Does it have coverage equally for people experiencing anorexia in a large body versus, the Coke classic anorexia, which many fewer people experience, like typical anorexia than this, I hate this term, but atypical anorexia, right? Most people who experience anorexia actually aren't in the, storied, emaciated white teen body, right? And the other piece of this is other benefits, right? Many life insurance policies are not available to people over a certain arbitrary weight or over a certain BMI. So it makes a huge inequity for people who work at the same company who don't have access to the same benefits just by virtue of being in their natural body. Anyway, please get back to what you were saying. I just wanted to sort of add fuel to the wonderful fire you were burning.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I realize I've just been like chat, like just reading off the list. I'm like,
I was like, I need to say this too.
No, I love that. I love that. I mean, I'm really excited. I mean, I feel like I'm like, oh, I'm ready to start chatting. I just want to get to this, like
these are such articles, so wonderful. So please continue on.
Yes. So the fifth thing that we really talked about, Project Heal and I talked about when we were writing this article, was understand why eating disorders occur. And they specifically said eating disorders are often a form of coping internally with a difficulty out of a person's control. Eating disorders are not just about food or body image. And I thought that was so powerful, right? Because I think that's the key to sort of eating disorders remaining in this sort of ancillary space. I do think it's this sexist rendering of eating disorders as an issue of vanity, right? Which is a horrible, reductive, insulting, and humiliating perspective, frankly. But I think that's how it's through kind of those touch points that EDs are not taken as seriously as they should be. So I really appreciate that. And the final thing that we kind of talked about in the article was have resources available, just have things that are on file. I mean, I think it's really important, right? Like I do see a lot of the work I do at Forbes, in my opinion, is so that someone doesn't have to have this conversation and they can just send a link. So I think like creating an environment where not only resources are available, educational and otherwise, not just support for the person who's having an eating disorder, but like actually the people around them too, who like maybe should be aware that they probably have a person with an eating disorder in their friend circle, in their home, certainly in their workplace or wherever they congregate. And I think, specifically, sort of making sure that there's openness, right? Like, do you feel safe sending this link to like your boss or the HR person or your colleague or whatever? And I think that was like the sixth thing on the list. And I thought that was really amazing too. Yeah.
It's really interesting. Yeah, I think, you bring up like sending the link to HR, sending the link to a boss. And as much as companies can have company policy, you're still dealing with a human being who may have their own like raging fat phobia, weight bias, be entrenched in their own eating disorder and not be able to like see past their own biases when they receive a link, right? So much discrimination against people in larger bodies happens when it's like, another thing that you're yelling about, right? Like it gets mocked or brushed under a rug as something that's just not important, because if you really took things seriously, you would be, hitting the gym and not asking me to accept this body that is clearly your fault. Right. And in that way, I think things, sort of the weight bias and fat phobia gets perpetuated, and the culture of disordered eating or eating disorder becomes perpetuated. And also the piece of eating disorder, which many experience, which is presumed, I presume I will be invalidated if I even have the courage or ability to verbalize what my experience has been. I've been so invalidated by diet culture in so many ways that I don't have the words left anymore. I don't have the courage anymore because I already know what this outcome is going to be, right? And I think, we even look at workplaces as, when your first day of work, right? And you walk up to your desk, is there a chair that's going to fit you? Right? Like you were talking about weight limits on, activities, right? Well, there are also weight limits on chairs, right? They're also like, oh, we're going to have a company party in the courtyard. And those like folding chairs show up that have a weight limit of like 4 pounds. And you're like, cool, I'm going to not sit here. Right?
Yeah.
So it's also about environment, right? It's about the emotional environment and the culture, but it's also about the like physical nuts and bolts of what you're walking into.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, I kind of think, and this is why I often feel like it's so important to talk about eating disorders and fat phobia / weight discrimination in the same conversation, right? Because even though we understand eating disorders are, complex, in some ways, like I had a colleague explain it that, fat phobia can kind of be like, you can have the bullets in the gun, and fat phobia can kind of be the thing that ticks it, that sort of clicks it off, right? And I think that when you have a work environment where there are no fat people, where fat people clearly cannot access the space, where this sends a message that confirms, like, I can control whether I am accepted, loved, employed.
Right.
I think there is sort of a subconscious messaging that happens, and that I think, it's often through subconscious bias that these outcomes occur. It's not by overt malice, but I think that, it's how the bigotry kind of gets maintained, and it creates an environment where EDs can kind of go on unchecked. And in fact, be, in some ways, I think perhaps again, subconsciously or perhaps even consciously promoted,
Absolutely. And there's a lot of, for some people, I feel like participating in weight bias and fat phobia, especially as a a person who's not necessarily in a small body, there is some protective aspect to participating in the dominant diet culture, right? It says, hey, me too, right? Like, it's sort of like insulting yourself before someone else can. So you're like, listen, I'm like, I think, in some circles we call it the good fatty, right? Where you participate in these things because if you do, then I'm working on it. I already know, you don't have to tell me about it, right? I'm working on it, so I'm part of you. Like, I'm in on the joke. I'm in on this part of our culture, so I can be included. And often the cost of that inclusion is promotion of disordered eating or the eating disorder. And I think that's an important piece to look at also, because a lot of people struggle to enter recovery because they lose their key, right? They lose their entry ticket into being able to feel part of, especially when a dominant culture in a workplace is this diet culture that we all live inside.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think like, I feel like the participation in diet culture, again, especially if you're in a marginalized body in some way where you're not part of the dominant culture, it can become, participation can become a way in which you signal that you're not a threat,
Right.
that you're not interested in disrupting, that, like you were saying, like you're on the same page of sort of creating a very specific idea of success as a very specific aesthetic of being, a particular kind of person. Maybe that's a successful person or a team player, or, someone who is seen as being on board with dominant notions of health, right? Because I think that, whether we want to admit it or not, right? Like a lot of times work cultures, work doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within a cultural context, and sort of bracketing that are things like insurance, are things like the medical field, you know what I mean? And it's like, there are these, and then I think obviously, right, like the sort of, I mean, I think another thing that's important to call out is, going back to kind of that client facing conversation earlier, industries that are very image focused, that are very client facing forward, that are sort of about a very specific kind of branding, especially if that branding is aligned with normative ideas of success, you better believe like fat phobia and eating disorders are baked into that, whether it be through policy or through normative social, rituals or whatever. So I think, I think that's the thing, right? Like on the one hand, we want to sort of have this idea of like, like, maybe my workplace is unique, and it is unique, but I think again, none of us is outside of like, ideas of like the BMI being used to indicate whether or not, like you were saying, whether or not you're going to be able to qualify for a certain kind of benefit, whether or not you're going to be able to qualify for a certain kind of, unfortunately, like incentives at companies like Whole Foods, for example. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. So, right. Like, and I think, that context really matters as you're thinking about it, right? Like policy, like, yeah, I mean, I can go on and on and on about that, but like, I'm always fascinated about kind of like, how do we take this conversation out of like the kind of the day-to-day, the mundane, like the moment where we're interfacing, and kind of blow it up. And it's like, what's really happening here? How is this conversation bracketed by like your employer's decisions about how much to spend on insurance, about how much to spend on, any number of things, right? And so like those decisions are all happening. And I think that it can feel right? When you're like in that position as someone with an ED or in a larger body or both, you might feel a bit gaslit, kind of like, oh, maybe I don't want to, like, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist here, but like, I think some of this might have to do with like economic incentive, right? Like, and you feel like that jerk who's being paranoid, which
Right.
of course is kind of part of like the cycle of being a marginalized person. It's just like that constant kind of having to be hyper vigilant, then doubting your hyper vigilance, feeling ashamed of your hyper vigilance, right? And then it's a cycle, and it just creates more distress, which leads to a double down on coping behaviors, including things like eating disorders, like including diet culture and all of this.
Absolutely. It rapidly becomes not about the mundane day to day. It rapidly becomes about the entirety of the sort of umbrella of the workplace, and how the dominant culture of a workplace and of a culture all come together, right? Like this, the Whole Foods incentives, mind-boggling, right? And also all of these things fly in the face of what we actually know about what promotes health, right? What promotes health is moving your body joyfully and regularly, reducing stress, nourishing your body intuitively, having connection, right? One of the greatest predictors of longevity is human to human connection and contact. And when we promote eating disorder or diet culture full workplaces, we're promoting severing of connection. Like, we're promoting severing of connection to self and of connection to others, especially for people who are in marginalized bodies and therefore more vulnerable.
100%. Yeah.
I know we just have, a little under 10 minutes left, and you have this amazing book, Body Positive Journal, and I wanted to just ask you if you would talk about that a little bit. Would you?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I know it's a bit of a topic switch, but I needed to get it in there. Oh, great.
Yeah, I mean, the Body Positive Journal is kind of, it's like, it's kind of, there's like, where do we even begin? It's kind of like, one of the things I love to do is, imagine alternative futures, imagine alternative worlds, because, right, like, we can create, I do believe that we have the power to create a culture where people don't have eating disorders, people don't experience weight discrimination. And I love creating opportunities to sort of, create like visual representations that you can kind of like enter and experience that world. And I kind of think of the Body Positive Journal as a little bit like that. I worked really hard with the illustrator of the book, and and she's an amazing like South American woman illustrator who is really, she always incorporates big bodies into all of her work. She just renders, I think what's amazing is like, that's her worldview, is like, she just renders all bodies as big. I've never seen her draw like a small body. And I think she even renders her vision of smaller bodied people are also big people. So it's like, she's got this really fun way of interacting. And I mean, frankly, we all benefit when we see bigger bodies. We all benefit when we see body diversity, like, even if that's not your body size, just because of the ubiquity of like the small body, like the thin body. So I really wanted to create kind of like a visual intervention, right? Because you can change what bodies you see as your brain codes as normal if you have enough visual exposure. So I kind of wanted to create a little bit of that, like with the book, and in sort of like a not super scientific, like really fun way. So there's just dozens of visual representations of bodies, big bodies doing fun things, like things that, and again, like, I think for me, I grew up really seeing, and I think we still largely think of higher weight people as like sad and inactive and lacking in passion. And so, you know, all of the characters in the book, which are just kind of there, like hanging out with you as you're journaling, are knitting and hanging out with their cat and going for like like skateboarding, and or they're doing yoga, or they're kind of like doing, it's like they're actively doing like what they love. And that was really important to me. And then I kind of thought, you know, it's a super vibrant, very colorful journal that has stickers, and it's kind of like, I mean, I really designed it so that it could basically be used by anyone from like probably a fifth grader up, or maybe like a really precocious fourth grader. I talked to a sixth grader about it, and she was like, I would say that like probably a fourth grader could do it. So according to a sixth grader, a fourth grader could do it maybe. And so anyway, like, you know, it's sort of, it's marketed to adults, but it's been really fun seeing actually like younger people take it on. But anyway, so I wanted to kind of create like this vibrant, cute, fun world that where you could basically like contemplate and contemplate like really important questions as you are learning to change your relationship to your body, to food, and to the culture, and to diet culture in particular. But I also wanted to create opportunities where people could practice skills that are really important. Like, for example, one of the skills I call the skill developing ones are kind of some of them are called field notes. So for example, I will say, you know, spend today not talking at all, either positively or negatively, about food or bodies. Just like zip the lip. You can talk about whatever else you want, but no food or body talk. And then take field notes about like what your day was like as you undertook this challenge or whatever. And similarly, right, like there's activities about learning how to set boundaries, learning the difference between your inner circle and kind of then the next level and the next level and the next level, and deciding, you know, changing boundaries and changing like code switching, kind of learning how to code switch as you move from your inner circle to the outside world. And like these are basically like there's about 30 prompts, and they're kind of the like 30 most important, I would say, skills that I've undertaken and practiced with others over the past 10 years that really are kind of like the ingredients for really important change around how you relate to your body and to food. So I'm really proud of it. It's really sweet. And I kind of want to, I mean, I was going to say this before, it's unrelated to the book. I mean, it's available for sale now. That's my commercial. Like if you would like to buy it, it's really, really fun and cute. I was going to pivot a little bit from that. Is I was thinking about a moment when, like a work moment recently that happened that was like one of those moments where I was like, wow, this is rad, and this is something that I need to share with people, because it was an example of a work conversation that honored the totality of who I am, and didn't try to kind of like shove me, and it's specifically like being in a larger body. And but it was like an email correspondence, and it was about flight accommodations to something, and they were like, we are happy to pay for first class, or we will buy you a second seat on an airplane. And it was just, and they were like, whatever is available, the better option is what we will get for you. And it was, I mean, you know, obviously like it's such a, like first class can be quite pricey sometimes. So I know that's not always available for people, but the fact that kind of like, you know, it was like just brought up, and I didn't have to advocate for it. And it was like this sense that it was like, it was this sense, not only was I being accommodated, but I was sort of being upgraded in the sense that, you know, because I think sometimes when accommodations happen, it feels like it's almost like a downgrade.
Yeah,
like absolutely. I'm like, you're accommodating me technically, but like I'm in the back of the thing, and I have to sit next to a chicken coop, or like, you know, or whatever. Yeah. And this was one of those moments where I was like, wow, like they're happy to kind of pay for my fat body to like get from one place to another. And it was just like, so I could feel in my nervous system that it was like healing something, you know? So yeah, a bit of a detour, but I kind of really wanted to share that, like a moment when like a work conversation went really well. And I felt like it kind of like transformed me a little bit, you know?
It's transformational and a wonderful like bow to put on what employers can do to equalize, normalize, and accommodate all bodies in the workplace. Oh, and here's Kath.
Yeah, I just noticed the time. I got so lost in the conversation and I just completely lost track of time. Virgie, thank you so much for joining us. It was just such a beautiful, informative conversation. I just want to say I love your energy. You are so electric, and I'm just so grateful that we were able to have you here Within Summit.
Thank you so much.
Always,
course.
always my absolute pleasure to get to speak to you, Virgie.
Thank you both so much. Katie, thank you. Virgie, again, thank you so much for being here. And to all of our attendees, thank you for tuning in and being a part of our first annual Within Summit. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.